Red and blue lights painted my backyard fence in an eerie glow as two police officers stood at my back gate, notebooks in hand. The taller one, Officer Martinez, looked between me and the dripping wet teenager standing beside my pool, his eyes narrowing with confusion. The kid, maybe 17 with bleached hair plastered to his forehead, was breathing heavily and gesturing wildly at the smart lock mounted on my gate. "Sir, we received a 911 call about someone being trapped behind a locked gate," Officer Martinez said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen it all. "This young man claims he was locked in your backyard and couldn't get out." I looked at the teenager, recognizing him immediately as Brandon, the HOA President's son. His designer swim shorts were soaked, and puddles formed at his feet on my carefully maintained patio stones. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was standing in my private backyard, on my property, complaining about being trapped somewhere he had no business being in the first place. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly, pulling out my phone. "This young man wasn't trapped, he was trespassing, and I have the footage to prove it." The second officer, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Can you explain what happened here, sir?" I had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 8 peaceful years before Linda Patterson became our HOA president. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with working families and retirees who minded their own business and kept their properties neat. My house sat on a corner lot with a privacy-fenced backyard that included a modest in-ground pool, nothing fancy, but perfect for cooling off during the brutal Texas summers. Everything changed 6 months ago when I started noticing subtle signs that someone had been in my backyard. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. A pool chair moved slightly out of place, a towel that I was certain I had folded left crumpled on the deck, wet footprints on dry concrete when I hadn't used the pool in days. Living alone since my divorce, I kept meticulous track of my space, so these small disturbances gnawed at me. The smart lock had been my solution. After researching various options, I settled on a high-tech model that required either a key fob, a numerical code, or smartphone access to open. It automatically locked after 30 seconds and kept detailed logs of every entry and exit. The installation took an entire Saturday, but I felt satisfied knowing my property was finally secure. Linda Patterson noticed the new hardware within days. She appeared at my front door on a Tuesday evening, her perfectly styled auburn hair and power suit making her look like she was heading to a corporate boardroom rather than discussing neighborhood matters. Her smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes as she launched into her inquiry. "I couldn't help but notice your new gate situation," she said, her tone suggesting casual interest while her body language screamed interrogation. "Very high-tech looking. I was wondering if you could share the access codes with the HOA board, for emergencies." I politely declined, explaining that the lock was for my private property and that any true emergency would involve first responders who could easily access my yard through other means if necessary. Her smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. Of course," she said, though something in her voice suggested our conversation was far from over. "I just want to make sure we're following all the neighborhood guidelines about modifications." That should have been the end of it. But Linda Patterson was not someone who accepted no for an answer easily. Over the following weeks, the mysterious disturbances in my backyard not only continued, but escalated. Pool chemicals that I kept locked in my storage shed were being used, evidenced by the stronger chlorine smell and the fact that my chemical levels were perfect despite my not having treated the water in over a week. Someone was maintaining my pool better than I was, and they clearly had more experience than a casual trespasser would possess. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, provided the missing piece of the puzzle during a chance encounter at our mailboxes. She was a retired teacher in her 70s who spent most of her day tending to her garden, which gave her a perfect view of the neighborhood's comings and goings. She said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "I've seen Linda's boy and his friends going around to your backyard when your car isn't in the driveway, usually in the afternoons when school lets out." The pieces fell into place with shocking clarity. Brandon Patterson and his crew had been treating my pool like their private clubhouse, timing their visits for when I was at work. They were experienced swimmers who knew how to maintain a pool, which explained the perfect chemical balance. They had probably been doing this for months before I installed the smart lock. Mrs. Chen continued, her voice dropping even lower. I thought about saying something sooner, but Linda has been so aggressive about neighborhood issues lately. She threatened to fine the Johnsons for their rose bushes being 6 inches too tall. I didn't want to cause trouble. I thanked her for the information and decided to set a trap. The next day, I left for work as usual, but parked my car around the corner and walked back to my house. I positioned myself at my upstairs bedroom window with a clear view of the backyard and waited. At exactly 3:15, just as Mrs. Chen had described, I watched Brandon Patterson climb over my fence, followed by 2 other teenagers I recognized from the neighborhood. They moved with the confidence of people who had done this many times before, immediately setting up towels and diving into the pool without any hesitation. I could have confronted them then, but I wanted irrefutable proof. I let them swim for about an hour, recording everything on my phone, before they decided to leave. That's when my smart lock system proved its worth in ways I hadn't anticipated. The gate's automatic locking mechanism engaged 30 seconds after they had entered, just as programmed. When Brandon approached the gate to leave, he discovered what I had hoped potential burglars would learn. Once locked, the gate required proper authorization to open. His key fob wouldn't work because he didn't have one. He didn't know the numerical code, and his phone wasn't registered in the system. From my window, I watched him pull and push at the gate with increasing desperation. His friends joined him, all 3 of them working together to try to force the mechanism, but the lock was designed to withstand exactly this kind of tampering. After about 10 minutes of failed attempts, I saw Brandon pull out his phone. I was already heading downstairs when I heard sirens in the distance. The audacity was breathtaking. Rather than call his mother or ask a neighbor for help, rather than admit he had been trespassing, this teenager had called 911 and presumably lied to emergency dispatchers about being trapped. The police arrived before I could reach my backyard, and I met them at my front door. Officer Martinez and Officer Rodriguez introduced themselves and explained they were responding to an emergency call about someone locked in a backyard. I calmly led them through my house to the back door, where we found Brandon still dripping wet and now putting on an Academy Award-worthy performance of distress. "Thank goodness you're here," he said to the officers, his voice shaking with what I'm sure he hoped sounded like trauma. "I was visiting my friend here, and when I tried to leave, the gate malfunctioned. I've been trapped for hours." Officer Rodriguez looked at her watch. "Son, the call came in 23 minutes ago." Brandon's face flushed, but he pressed on with his story. "It felt like hours. I was panicking. I have claustrophobia." I stepped forward, my phone already loaded with the smart lock's access logs. "Officers, I need to show you something. This young man has never been invited to my property. He's been trespassing, and I have proof." The smart lock system was more sophisticated than I had initially realized. Not only did it record entry and exit times, but it also maintained video logs of everyone who approached the gate. I showed the officers footage from that afternoon. Brandon climbing over my fence at 3:15, followed by his 2 friends who had apparently managed to climb back out the same way they entered. "The system shows no authorized entry today," I explained, scrolling through the digital records. "The last time someone used proper credentials to enter was 4 days ago when I had my pool maintenance service here." Officer Martinez studied the timestamp on the video, then looked at Brandon with renewed interest. "Son, this footage shows you climbing over a fence to enter this property. That's trespassing." Brandon's confident demeanor cracked like an eggshell. I thought, my mom said it was okay. She's the HOA President. She has authority over neighborhood properties." Both officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their experience with entitled teenagers and overreaching homeowner associations. Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Brandon, her voice taking on the firm tone of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. "Young man, being the HOA President doesn't give anyone authority to enter private property without permission. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to lie to emergency dispatchers about being trapped when you were actually trespassing." The power dynamic shifted so quickly I almost felt dizzy. Minutes earlier, Brandon had been playing the victim, confident that his story would hold up and that I would somehow be blamed for his predicament. Now he stood there in soaked swim shorts, facing two police officers who were clearly unimpressed with his performance. Officer Martinez turned to me. "Sir, do you want to press charges for trespassing?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do. And I'd like to file a report about the ongoing harassment from his mother regarding access to my private property." Brandon's eyes went wide with panic. "Wait, you can't do that. My mom will kill me. I'm supposed to start college in the fall. A criminal record will ruin everything." "You should have thought about that before you decided to treat someone else's property like your personal swimming pool," Officer Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "And before you wasted emergency services time with a false report?" As the officers began paperwork for the trespassing citation, I called Linda Patterson. She answered on the first ring, her voice immediately taking on the syrupy tone she used when she wanted something. "Hello, neighbor. I hope you're having a lovely evening. Mrs. Patterson, your son is in my backyard with two police officers. He's been arrested for trespassing, and I thought you should know." The silence on the other end stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "There must be some mistake. Brandon would never trespass. He's a good boy. He's been using my pool without permission for months, Mrs. Patterson. I have video evidence and digital records. The police have everything they need." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "This is ridiculous. As HOA President, I have the authority to access any property for inspections and emergency situations." Officer Martinez, who had been listening to my side of the conversation, held out his hand for the phone. I passed it to him, and he identified himself before speaking in his professional law enforcement voice. "Ma'am, this is Officer Martinez with the police department. Your son has been cited for criminal trespassing and filing a false emergency report. Neither you nor he has any legal authority to enter private property without permission, regardless of your position in the homeowner association." Even standing several feet away, I could hear Linda's voice rising to near shriek levels through the phone. Officer Martinez held the device away from his ear, wincing at the volume before cutting her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come collect your son, and I'd suggest you consult with a lawyer about the limits of HOA authority before this situation gets worse." Linda Patterson arrived at my house in record time, screeching into my driveway in her white luxury sedan. She emerged from the vehicle like a hurricane, her perfect composure completely abandoned. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her power suit wrinkled as if she had been pacing frantically before driving over. "This is absolutely outrageous," she announced to everyone within hearing distance, which included Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors who had gathered on their front porches to watch the spectacle. "My son is a good kid who made an innocent mistake." Officer Rodriguez looked up from her citation book with the expression of someone who had reached the absolute limit of her patience. "Ma'am, your son climbed over a fence to access private property without permission, then lied to emergency dispatchers about being trapped. There's nothing innocent about any of that." Linda's face turned an alarming shade of red as she processed the fact that her usual intimidation tactics were having zero effect on the police officers. She spun toward me, pointing an accusatory finger that shook with rage. "You did this on purpose. You set some kind of trap for children. That lock is dangerous, and I'm going to make sure the HOA removes it immediately." I remained calm, which seemed to infuriate her even more. "Mrs. Patterson, your son has been trespassing on my property for months. The smart lock is a legal security measure installed on my private gate. If you had any authority to remove it, which you don't, I would file a lawsuit faster than you could blink." The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and I could see phones being pulled out to record the confrontation. Linda seemed to realize she was making a public spectacle of herself, but her anger was too overwhelming for her to regain control. "We'll see about that," she snarled. "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. This neighborhood has rules, and you're going to follow them whether you like it or not." Officer Martinez finished his paperwork and handed Brandon the citation. "Son, you have a court date in 3 weeks. I suggest you use that time to think about better decision-making. And ma'am," he addressed Linda directly, "filing false complaints or abusing your position in the homeowner association can result in criminal charges as well. I'd be very careful about your next moves." The police officers left, taking with them the last remnants of Linda's confidence. She grabbed Brandon by the arm and dragged him toward her car, hissing threats and promises of consequences that I was sure would fall more heavily on me than on her son. Mrs. Chen approached as the Patterson car disappeared around the corner. "I'm sorry you had to deal with all of that," she said quietly. "But I'm glad you stood up to her. She's been bullying people in this neighborhood for months." Over the next few days, word of the incident spread through Willowbrook Estates faster than wildfire. Neighbors I barely knew stopped me during my evening walks to share their own stories of Linda Patterson's overreach. The Johnsons told me about the Rosebush fine Mrs. Chen had mentioned, which had cost them $300 for violating a height restriction that wasn't actually in the HOA bylaws. The Garcias had been threatened with legal action for parking their work truck in their own driveway overnight. The elderly Mr. Williams had been cited for having decorative garden stones that were allegedly the wrong color. A pattern emerged that painted Linda Patterson not as a dedicated community leader, but as someone who had been systematically abusing her position to harass neighbors over petty grievances. Brandon's trespassing incident wasn't an isolated problem. It was the culmination of months of entitled behavior that had gone unchecked. I spent the weekend compiling evidence for my formal complaint to the HOA board. The smart lock system had been more valuable than I ever imagined, providing time-stamped logs that proved Brandon had been accessing my property regularly for over 2 months. I also gathered documentation of Linda's demands for my gate codes and her threats to fine me for installing security measures on my own property. The regular monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center. I arrived early, carrying a laptop loaded with video evidence and printed copies of all relevant documentation. The usual crowd of 20 or so residents was there, but tonight the room was packed with at least 60 people, more than I had ever seen at a neighborhood meeting. Linda called the meeting to order with her usual authoritative tone, but I could see the stress in her face. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, and her normally perfect appearance was slightly disheveled. She launched into the standard agenda items, clearly hoping to avoid the elephant in the room. During the open comment period, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The conversations that had been buzzing quietly through the audience stopped completely, and all eyes focused on me. "I need to address a serious issue involving abuse of HOA authority and criminal trespassing by board members' family," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. Linda's face went pale, but she tried to maintain control. "This is not the appropriate venue for personal grievances." "Actually, it's exactly the appropriate venue," I replied, opening my laptop. "Because this involves the HOA President using her position to cover up her son's criminal behavior and to harass residents who refuse to comply with illegal demands." I connected my laptop to the room's projection system and began showing the footage of Brandon climbing over my fence. The audience watched in stunned silence as the video clearly showed him trespassing on my property with 2 friends. I followed this with screenshots of the smart lock logs, proving that the unauthorized access had been happening for months. The HOA President demanded access codes to my private property, claiming emergency authority she doesn't legally possess. I continued. When I refused, her son continued trespassing. When he got locked in by my security system, he filed a false police report instead of admitting he was breaking the law. The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors began connecting dots between my situation and their own experiences with Linda's overreach. Mrs. Johnson stood up and shouted over the chaos. "She fined us $300 for rose bushes that weren't even violating any actual rules." I looked up the bylaws myself. Mr. Garcia joined in, his voice tight with anger. "She threatened to tow my work truck from my own driveway. Said it was a commercial vehicle violation, but I checked with the city, and there's no such restriction." The floodgates had opened, and months of suppressed frustration poured out as neighbor after neighbor shared their stories of Linda's harassment and abuse of power. She sat frozen at the head table, her face cycling through shock, anger, and what looked like growing panic as the extent of her misconduct became public. I held up my hand for quiet and continued with my presentation. "I've filed criminal charges against her son for trespassing and false reporting. I'm also filing a formal complaint with the HOA management company about the president's abuse of authority and harassment of residents." The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Voices rose in support, with multiple people calling for Linda's resignation. Someone in the back shouted, "Call for a vote of no confidence." Others began chanting, "Resign, resign." Linda finally found her voice, standing up shakily and trying to restore order. "This is all a misunderstanding. My son made a mistake, but this man set a trap for children. His dangerous lock system is the real problem here." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in laughter. The absurdity of blaming me for installing security measures on my own property while her son was committing crimes was too much for even her most loyal supporters to defend. Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat in the front row. "Linda, your son is 17 years old. He's not a child. He's old enough to know that climbing into someone else's backyard without permission is wrong. And you're old enough to know that being HOA President doesn't make you queen of the neighborhood." The applause was thunderous. Linda looked around the room desperately, searching for any sign of support, but found only angry faces and shaking heads. The other board members, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, began whispering among themselves with worried expressions. Board member Tom Rodriguez cleared his throat and addressed the room. "In light of these serious allegations, I move that we suspend Linda Patterson from her duties as HOA President, pending a full investigation by the management company." "Seconded," called out board member Sarah Kim immediately. The vote was unanimous among the remaining board members, with Linda's voice being the only dissent. As the gavel fell, officially suspending her from her position, Linda gathered her papers with shaking hands and stood to leave. "This isn't over," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'll fight this. I'll sue all of you." But her threat fell flat in the room full of neighbors who had finally found their voices after months of intimidation. As she walked toward the exit, the crowd remained silent, watching her go with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. The meeting continued for another hour as the interim board discussed reviewing all of Linda's decisions over the past year and refunding fines that had been improperly assessed. A committee was formed to work with the management company on establishing clearer guidelines about the limits of HOA authority. 2 weeks later, I received notification that Brandon Patterson had pleaded guilty to criminal trespassing and filing a false police report. His sentence included community service, a fine, and probation. More importantly for the neighborhood, Linda Patterson had been permanently removed from the HOA board following the management company's investigation, which found multiple violations of their fiduciary duties and abuse of authority. The final twist came when I decided to upgrade my pool security even further. The smart lock had worked perfectly, but the whole experience had made me realize that privacy and security were worth investing in properly. I installed a biometric scanner system that required fingerprint access, along with additional security cameras that covered the entire backyard. The irony was delicious when Mrs. Johnson knocked on my door the following weekend asking for advice about installing a similar system for her own pool. Within a month, 3 other neighbors had upgraded their security, all citing the Patterson incident as their motivation. Linda Patterson quietly put her house on the market 6 weeks after the HOA meeting. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday evening, moving trucks were loading their belongings. She never spoke to me again, but Mrs. Chen mentioned seeing her at the grocery store, where she had apparently told anyone who would listen that the neighborhood was full of unreasonable people who didn't understand proper authority. The new HOA president, elected unanimously by the board, was Mr. Williams, the elderly man who had been harassed about his garden stones. His first official act was to review and revoke 17 improperly issued fines, including the Johnson's rosebush penalty. His second act was to establish a clear policy that HOA authority ended at property lines, and that residents' security measures were not subject to association approval as long as they complied with city ordinances. Brandon Patterson's college plans, according to neighborhood gossip, had indeed been affected by his criminal record. Several universities had withdrawn their acceptance offers after learning about his trespassing conviction, a consequence that might have been avoided if he had simply asked permission to use my pool in the first place. The investigation into Linda's conduct revealed even more disturbing patterns than anyone had initially suspected. The management company's audit uncovered financial irregularities in how fines were being collected and distributed. Several residents had paid penalties for violations that were never properly documented, and some of the money had apparently been used for unauthorized HOA expenses, including landscaping for Linda's own property. Mrs. Garcia discovered that Linda had been forging signatures on violation notices, claiming that multiple board members had signed off on fines when, in reality, she had been acting unilaterally. The management company found at least 12 instances where Linda had issued citations without following proper procedures or giving residents the required notice periods to correct alleged violations. The scope of the misconduct extended beyond simple power trips. Linda had been using her position to settle personal grudges and intimidate neighbors who had crossed her in various ways. The Hendersons, an elderly couple at the end of the street, revealed that they had been harassed for months about their mailbox placement after Mrs. Henderson had politely declined to join Linda's book club. The violations were completely fabricated, but the couple had been too frightened of escalating legal costs to fight back. Even more troubling was the discovery that Linda had been accessing the neighborhood's security gate codes and giving them to Brandon and his friends, allowing them to bypass the main entrance and avoid being seen by residents when they went pool hopping. The security company confirmed that Linda had requested and received master codes under the pretense of HOA business, then shared them with unauthorized individuals. The criminal charges against Brandon expanded as well. During the investigation, police discovered that he and his friends had been trespassing on multiple properties throughout the neighborhood, not just mine. The smart lock logs from my pool were used as evidence to establish a pattern of behavior, and other homeowners came forward with similar stories of missing pool chemicals, rearranged furniture, and signs of unauthorized access. Detective Sarah Lopez, who took over the case from the responding officers, explained to me that teenage trespassing rings were becoming increasingly common in affluent neighborhoods. These kids think they're entitled to use anything they want as long as they don't break anything obvious. She said during one of our follow-up meetings, "Your smart lock system is exactly the kind of evidence we need to prosecute these cases effectively." Brandon's two accomplices, Tyler Morrison and Jake Chen, were also charged with criminal trespassing after security footage from multiple properties confirmed their involvement. The trio had apparently been operating their unauthorized pool circuit for over a year, targeting homes with privacy fences and absent homeowners during peak swimming season. The legal consequences extended beyond the teenagers. Linda Patterson faced charges for abuse of office and fraud related to the improper collection of HOA fines. The district attorney's office took a particular interest in the case because it represented a pattern of public corruption, even at the neighborhood level. Her lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the extensive documentation I had provided, combined with testimony from dozens of affected residents, made her position essentially indefensible. During the court proceedings, I learned more about Linda's background that explained her sense of entitlement. She had previously been involved in similar controversies at two other homeowner associations in different cities, leaving both under suspicious circumstances. Her pattern was to seek positions of authority, abuse that power for personal gain, or to settle grudges, then move away when the situation became untenable. The trial revealed that Linda had been planning to run for city council, using her HOA presidency as a stepping stone to higher office. Her campaign strategy had apparently involved demonstrating her ability to maintain strict neighborhood standards and increase property values through aggressive enforcement. The irony was that her overreach had the opposite effect, creating a hostile environment that actually decreased property values as potential buyers learned about the association's dysfunction. Brandon's sentencing hearing provided the most dramatic moment of the entire ordeal. The judge, Honorable Margaret Torres, was known for her tough stance on entitled behavior by privileged teenagers. She had clearly done her homework on the case, referencing not just the trespassing charges but the broader context of systematic rule-breaking enabled by parental corruption. "Young man," Judge Torres addressed Brandon directly, "your mother's position of authority in this community should have taught you about responsibility and respect for others' property. Instead, it appears to have taught you that rules don't apply to people like you. This court intends to correct that misunderstanding." Brandon's sentence included 60 hours of community service, specifically focused on property maintenance and security installation for elderly residents, ensuring he would understand the value of the privacy and security he had violated. He was also required to write personal apology letters to every homeowner whose property he had accessed without permission, and to attend counseling sessions about respect for others' rights. The civil lawsuits that followed were equally consequential. I filed a lawsuit against both Linda and Brandon for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. Several other homeowners joined similar actions, creating a class action suit that ultimately cost the Patterson family tens of thousands of dollars in settlements and legal fees. Linda's homeowner's insurance refused to cover the civil judgments, arguing that her actions fell under intentional misconduct rather than accidental liability. Her husband, who had remained largely silent throughout the controversy, filed for divorce 3 months after her conviction, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to protect his assets from further legal exposure. The new HOA board, led by Mr. Williams, implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future abuse of authority. They established a resident ombudsman position to investigate complaints about board conduct, created transparent procedures for issuing violations, and required all fines to be approved by majority vote rather than individual board members. The community also invested in upgraded security measures throughout the neighborhood. Inspired by the effectiveness of my smart lock system, the HOA approved funding for enhanced gate access controls and additional security cameras at common areas. The investment was popular with residents who had grown tired of unauthorized access by teenagers and other trespassers. My own security upgrades became something of a neighborhood attraction. The biometric system I installed was so advanced that other homeowners regularly asked for demonstrations of how it worked. I became an unofficial consultant for residents who wanted to upgrade their own security, helping them choose systems appropriate for their needs and budgets. The most satisfying aspect of the resolution was watching the neighborhood transform from a place of tension and fear into a genuine community. With Linda's intimidation tactics removed, residents began interacting more freely, organizing social events, and looking out for each other's properties. The HOA meetings, once dreaded confrontations, became productive discussions about actual community improvement. Mrs. Chen started a neighborhood watch program that used technology to supplement traditional vigilance. Ring doorbells and security cameras were networked to create a comprehensive monitoring system that deterred crime and helped residents keep track of suspicious activity. The program was so successful that other neighborhoods began requesting information about how to implement similar initiatives. The pool security industry took notice of my case as well. The smart lock manufacturer contacted me about using my experience as a testimonial for their products, highlighting how the technology had not only protected my property, but had exposed a broader pattern of criminal behavior. They offered me a discount on additional security products and asked for my input on future product development. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, particularly focusing on the broader issues of HOA abuse and teenage crime in suburban communities. I was interviewed several times about the importance of property rights and the effectiveness of technology in protecting homeowners from both criminal activity and governmental overreach. The coverage brought attention to similar problems in other neighborhoods throughout the city. Several other HOA presidents were investigated following complaints from residents who had been inspired by our successful challenge to Linda Patterson's authority. The City Council eventually passed new ordinances limiting HOA enforcement powers and establishing clearer procedures for residents to appeal association decisions. Real estate agents began marketing homes in Willowbrook Estates as being in a reformed HOA community, emphasizing the new transparent governance and resident-friendly policies. Property values, which had stagnated during Linda's reign of harassment, began increasing as buyers recognized the stability and fairness of the new management approach. The smart lock continued to work flawlessly, logging the occasional delivery person or service technician, but never again recording any unauthorized access attempts. Sometimes in the evenings, I would sit by my pool and think about how a simple security upgrade had exposed an entire network of abuse and entitlement that had been poisoning our neighborhood for months. The whole experience taught me that technology, when used properly, doesn't just protect property. It can protect entire communities from those who would abuse their power. Linda Patterson had counted on people being too intimidated to challenge her authority, too isolated to compare their experiences, and too polite to make a public stand against her harassment. The smart lock had given me the evidence I needed to fight back, but more importantly, it had given my neighbors the courage to speak up about their own experiences. Sometimes the best security system isn't just about keeping bad people out. It's about empowering good people to stand up for what's right.